This is a presentation on adaptations to internal quality assurance in Irish higher education institutions in response to the Covid-19. There were three sources for our analysis. The first was a report conducted by QQI in the summer of 2020, and that's the impact of Covid-19 modifications to teaching, learning and assessment in Irish further education and training and higher education. We'll be calling that the QQI TLA report for the rest of this presentation, and you'll be hearing a little more about that on the next slide. Our second source was a set of meeting notes from QQI's periodic quality dialogue meetings, which are held every 2 years with the public higher education institutions. These meetings were conducted online in June and July 2020, so they gave QQI a really good idea of how the public HEIs had responded to the Covid-19 pandemic and what, if any, modifications were required to their internal quality assurance systems in that response. The third source is a survey of websites of Irish public higher education institutions that was conducted between March and August 2020 and considered the type of information that institutions were providing to their internal and external stakeholders on their websites. This is a short video that will give an overview of how the QQI TLA report was compiled, as well as the collaboration necessary for its drafting.
This QQI report on the modified arrangements to teaching, learning and assessment in further education training and higher education demonstrate the strong level of connectivity and collaboration across the sector, which is essential in a small country like Ireland. Critical to the success of producing this report in a limited timeframe were the contributions by our stakeholders. To encourage maximum collaboration on this project, an accelerated sectoral consultation took place between April and July. As part of the process, we consulted with students and student representative organisations, social partners, technical support organisations, government departments, state agencies, representative bodies, further education training providers, and both public and private higher education institutions. In total, 56 organisations and institutions made voluntary contributions following an intensive series of meetings arranged by QQI's Stakeholder Engagement Unit. This was the nature of collaboration in Ireland and continues to be. The report identified many examples of good practice across the sector, which will continue into the future and help to ensure learning outcomes were met across programmes, allowing confidence and qualifications achieved in 2020 to be sustained.
This presentation will consider the adaptation of internal quality assurance systems in three discrete areas. So the first two, policies and procedures and governance, align with ESG 1.1. The third area aligns with ESG 1.8, public information, and we'll consider how public HEIs in Ireland communicated with their main stakeholder groups, external and internal, during the crisis. So in relation to that first area, policies and procedures, during our analysis, we found that on the whole, core institutional QA policies and procedures were considered by public HEIs to be sufficiently robust and flexible to accommodate the exceptional circumstances brought about by COVID-19. And on that point, we can give an example. So during the pandemic, HEIs were petitioned by students to adopt a no detriment principle. If they had adopted this principle, they would have agreed that student grades could not be negatively impacted by the extenuating circumstances caused by the crisis. However, in response to this request, the Irish HEIs adopted a no disadvantage principle, highlighting that, in fact, many existing policies and procedures already provide for consideration of exceptional circumstances. And it's worth noting that the Union of Students in Ireland were extremely supportive of this stance and encouraged their member organisations to be equally supportive. So we did note that in some cases, existing procedures were supplemented or amended to reflect online methodologies and to provide additional flexibility for students. One of the big conclusions we came to was that sectoral collaboration was very highly valued. And this was especially so in the Institute of Technology sector, and you'll be hearing a little bit more about that shortly. But there were system level discussions that included all relevant stakeholders across the further and higher education sectors. And these groups were convened regularly throughout this period to ensure a coherence of approach. In conducting our analysis, we noted that changes to core policies and procedures occurred under 4 main headings. The first of these was progression. So here there were examples such as allowing greater discretion in terms of deciding borderline cases for grades, and also in relation to carrying modules or credits into the next semester. We should emphasise, though, that where such amendments were made, they were quite limited. So although students may have been permitted to carry additional credits into the next semester, this may have been something like 10 credits as opposed to the usual 5. And here HEIs were really anxious to ensure that the quality and integrity of awards was maintained, and this was a fundamental principle kept to the forefront. The second heading is academic integrity, and here policies and procedures were enhanced to provide for assessment being conducted online or remotely. So this included things like allowing for remote proctoring. The third heading is deferral and extenuating circumstances, and under this heading we noted that often criteria were extended and expanded to reflect the fact that COVID-19 was an extenuating circumstance, and there was a very strong desire evident among the public HEIs to ensure that students weren't treated unfairly or disadvantaged in any way as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The final heading is online QA processes, and here policies and procedures were amended to reflect that many processes moved online. So Vivas, for example, moved online, as did program validation and accreditation panels. And it's interesting to note that some HEIs during our quality dialogue meetings stressed that this move online of validation and accreditation panels may provide additional scope for them to increase the number of international evaluators and reviewers on panels in future. The majority of higher education institutions developed contingency plans that outlined principles and guidelines for the delivery of teaching, learning and assessment during the emergency period. This approach reflects a recognition within the sector that a one-size-fits-all approach would not work. While HEIs did seek to outline parameters to ensure that quality was maintained, there was a strong sense that programmes and disciplines were really best placed to make decisions on appropriate changes to teaching, learning and assessment strategies. The principles and guidelines focused initially on assessment. Guidelines were developed to support approaches to alternative assessment with an emphasis on ensuring that learning outcomes were maintained and demonstrated by students. There was also a focus on academic integrity in relation to remote and online assessment. These principles and guidelines were often developed or supported by institutional centres for teaching and learning. And there were also guidelines to support planning for teaching and learning in the new academic year and quality assurance oversight of changes. These were very much informed by shared sectoral principles. As part of this presentation, we asked 3 representatives from the Irish HE sector to give their insight into the response across the sector from institutions to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first of our 3 speakers is Dr. Jim Murray from THEA, the Irish Technological Higher Education Association, and he gives an overview of the sectoral cohesion evident in the responses of the Institutes of Technology.
The Technological Higher Education Association represents and advocates for the 11 Institutes of Technology in Ireland. This advocacy work is underpinned by the activities of over 20 member networks. These networks have really come into their own during the Covid-19 crisis. As Director of Academic Affairs, I work closely with our Council of Registrars, a group comprised of the Chief Academic Officers of the institutes. The registrars met weekly during the initial lockdown period and have continued to meet more frequently than would have been the norm in pre-pandemic times. They work collaboratively, openly, and function as a community of practice in the areas of quality assurance and academic policy and practice. As and when necessary, they also develop shared policy approaches and operational guidance. The registrars produced 2 key documents during the crisis. One was a collective statement on reinforcing and monitoring the quality of our provision in the academic year 2020-21. The second document set out agreed principles and guidelines for the delivery of academic programmes in this Covid-19 affected academic year. Taken together, they represent important statements of sectoral cohesion and provide reassurance to staff, students and the wider stakeholder community.
Moving on to look at governance. We noted that in responding to the challenges posed by the pandemic, both in semester 2 of the academic year 2019 to 2020 and in planning for the next academic year, the majority of institutions augmented their governance structures with new committees and groups that explored how best to deal with the multitude of issues experienced and predicted as a result of COVID-19 and the associated public health restrictions. In the words of QQI's TLA report, typically, hierarchies of committees and working groups were involved in dealing with the coordinated management and implementation of change. Academic councils or equivalent were at the top of the hierarchy for the approval of modifications to programmes. So we noted that there were 3 broad categories of groups involved in responding to and planning to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. The first of these were contingency planning groups. These were often convened at an early juncture. Institutions with transnational provision were quite alert to the threats posed by COVID-19, and many of these began planning for a possible disruption as early as January 2020. There were also operational planning groups that looked at returning to campus post-lockdown and commencing academic year 2020-21. They coordinated institutions' transition from fully online provision to hybrid models of online and on-site provision. These also included groups that considered discrete issues, such as the amendment of the placement elements of programmes of education. We saw that some institutions ensured a broad membership of these groups to facilitate ample representation of students and staff, both academic and professional. In other institutions, there were separate groups or subgroups of overarching ones that were created to ensure that regard was had to the needs and responsibilities of particular constituencies and cohorts. So these included professional services staff, academic staff, postgraduate and undergraduate students. Finally, we noted that there were also horizon scanning groups, and these considered the long-term impacts of COVID-19 for the institution. In terms of the approaches that we noted among institutions in terms of academic decision-making, there was no single preferred approach, nor could or should there have been due to the strong institutional autonomy that we have in Ireland. However, there were similar approaches that were evident across the sector. Institutions emphasised that it was crucial to maintain governance structures, but that it was also important to have sufficient flexibility and agility. So in terms of the 2 approaches that we noted on the whole, the first of these is the subsidiarity-based approach, where authority was devolved by academic council to a subgroup to enable swift and agile decision-making. In the words of the TLA report, this distributed the work and avoided saturating the capacity of more central committees. as well as allowing for urgent decisions to be reached without having to wait for the next meeting of Academic Council. Often, the smaller size of the body to which authority had been devolved facilitated a more streamlined decision-making process, although one institution did note that such bodies must be of sufficient size or membership to ensure the requisite academic oversight and confidence. Subgroups were sometimes already existing, although sometimes these had their membership augmented to ensure that all relevant expertise was included, and sometimes they were newly convened groups. They also took various forms. They included standing and executive committees to Academic Council, and also programme boards were often empowered to effect modifications to teaching and learning strategies and to develop contingency plans for communication and retroactive approval by the Academic Council. Many of the institutions noted that this devolution of authority was time limited. It came with a sunset clause with the possibility of extension, however. The second approach that we noted to academic decision making was the retention of existing governance decision making structures where these were deemed sufficiently flexible to respond to the rapidly evolving public health situation. In this case, institutions emphasised that they already had clearly defined governance and management structures, and that these were capable of facilitating an adequate response to the crisis. So it was noted in the TLA report that some staff appreciated being able to work within academic governance structures that they were familiar with and had confidence in when amending their modules. Irrespective of the approach chosen by the institution, however, many institutions noted that the frequency with which the institution's academic council met increased, with meetings of academic councils and other groups conducted online, where meetings on site weren't permitted under public health guidance. We now come to the second of our sectoral representatives. Lewis Purser of the Irish Universities Association emphasises the importance of institutional autonomy and the agility of internal governance structures in the university's response to the pandemic.
So from the Irish Universities perspective, when COVID hit our universities in March, there were a need for urgent decisions regarding how assessment would proceed and how we would obviously need to adapt and change our somewhat old and traditional internal academic regulations regarding examinations and assessment. And to do this, we had to rely on the extensive institutional autonomy we have in Ireland for academic affairs, but also importantly on our strong internal quality assurance systems that we already have in place. The academic councils of our universities, which in some countries might be called academic senates, needed to devolve responsibility to the chief academic officer and sometimes the vice president or vice rector academic, who on the advice and recommendations of an ad hoc committee representing the full range of actors in the universities, academics, management staff and students, could take these decisions and ensure that they were applied evenly across the university. I just like to underline the importance of having that strong academic autonomy for academic matters, and also those strong internal quality assurance systems, which allow this to take place without compromising on the quality of the student learning outcome.
And so to our third and final section, the section on information to stakeholders provided by institutions. This slide provides a broad timeline of the events and the focus of information provided to stakeholders. You'll see from the slide that this focus shifted as the situation evolved. We should note that while there is a multitude of stakeholders for institutions, the majority of activity that was reported by HEIs in relation to communicating with stakeholders focused on information to teaching staff and to students. So this will be the primary focus of this presentation. In terms of communications with staff who teach, institutions emphasised that it was critical to have clear and structured communication strategies for their communications with both staff and students. In the words of one institution in QQI's TLA report, the development and implementation of a clear and structured communication strategy was essential to managing the overall situation and allowing a path forward towards successful completion of the academic year 1920. It helped with streamlining processes, developing fit-for-purpose alternative arrangements, and also helped reduce stress and anxiety among both students and staff associated with these. There were surveys of staff across the institutions, and these gauged how staff's remote working experience was and what supports they needed in delivering teaching, learning and assessment in the new virtual learning environment. An example from one institution was the provision of a dedicated website and call centre to provide resources for staff in relation to remote working. Supports for teaching staff in respect of teaching, learning and assessment were also provided by institutions. As noted in QQI's TLA report, all institutions had prior experience in delivering blended learning programmes. Nevertheless, moving programmes and modules online was a new experience for many teaching staff. Teaching and learning units in HEIs were instrumental in supporting their colleagues in adapting to the fully online environment. They created webinars, provided upskilling sessions and training on online platforms, and produced guidance documents for staff regarding development of alternative assessments. In some institutions there was one-to-one support, in others there were small group tutorials for staff in assisting with the pivot to online learning. IT departments and learning technologists across the institutions also played a significant role in developing lists of resources for staff, developing FAQ lists and rolling out workshops on technology platforms. There were some interesting examples of good practice in this regard. For example, some institutions provided digital badges on the completion of training or put forward particular staff members as digital champions. One institution included students as co-facilitators of staff training, which allowed students to give some examples of their own experiences of online learning. We noted that throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, institutions used their online platforms, their websites, Twitter, Instagram and Facebook accounts really effectively with students, along with other mechanisms for keeping students up to date and connected. And these included email, texts, help desks and evolving FAQ pages. We noted that sometimes there were differentiated approaches for different cohorts. So for example, with international students, there may have been direct contact over the phone and there may have been more regular contact. Students' unions were also key partners in disseminating information to students, and they did so very effectively. Following the government announcement to close campuses on the 12th of March, institution websites were really quick to refocus information online, and most introduced COVID-19 banners on their homepage, which took students directly to the relevant information. We saw that information was divided into a number of sections, which included health information, campus updates, IT support, remote learning, alternative assessment, and also well-being and health in terms of mental health. We saw that in many cases there was specific information provided for international students. Where websites didn't contain specific detail, it was apparent that students were being directly contacted by the institutions. The online information that we saw made available online was overwhelmingly for current students, but we did note that other stakeholders such as prospective students were kept informed by virtual open days. Communications online indicated that the transition to online teaching, learning and assessment was quick and relatively problem-free. We'll now hear from our final sectoral representative. Kevin McStravick of the Union of Students in Ireland will speak about the collaboration between student representatives and their institutions to ensure that key messages were communicated to learners in a timely and effective manner.
Hi there, my name is Kevin McStravick and I'm the Deputy President and Vice President for Academic Affairs for the Union of Students in Ireland. COVID-19 posed significant challenges to higher education here in Ireland this year, and students were right at the heart of facing those challenges head on. And this was achieved through students' unions working closely with their institutions to ensure that all key messages were communicated in a timely and effective manner to students so that they had clarity on the way in which they were going to be assessed, bearing in mind the rapid move to distance learning as a result of COVID-19. USI too worked very closely with key sector stakeholders and with QQI at a national level and ensured that decision makers were aware of the issues the students on the ground were facing, and likewise so that students had clear information on the measures.
Finally, we come to the conclusions of our analysis, and there are 4. First, we found that the principles of autonomy and subsidiarity supported agility and enabled tailored decision-making to suit individual institutions. Second, we found that across the sector, and as you'll have seen throughout this presentation, networks and collaboration were really instrumental in ensuring coordinated, coherent and effective responses. Third, we found that students and student representatives provide important contributions at institution level, and they were seen to be an invaluable means of communication with the wider student population. And fourth, a quote taken from QQI's TLA report: "The quality assurance infrastructure established by institutions proved crucial in the approaches to change management, which inspires confidence in the reasonableness of those changes." Finally, if you'd like to follow up on any of the themes covered in this presentation, the contact details for the 4 authors are available on this slide. You can also view QQI's TLA report at the link below, as well as details of QQI's own response to the COVID-19 pandemic.